Week 7, we're halfway through the semester. A beautiful semi-cloudy day here in Prescott, Arizona. Lovely scenes on the wall behind me from the shadows. Got a little bit of clouds today, but spring is coming. That is, if you're in the spring semester. You might be in the fall semester, I'm not sure. Anyway, this week we're really heavily into the middle of the hippie period, 1967, the Summer of Love. We had some very important albums come out in 1967, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But a number of things are going on in society at this time. Of course, we have the hippies, really from this explosion of LSD in the early 60s, brought about by Ken Kesey and his merry pranksters. But we also had the war in Vietnam, so we really had these two opposing forces going on. And the hippie movement was pretty much a West Coast phenomenon. There were some hippies in New York, but not too much. Now, I was born in 1953, so Summer of Love, 1967, I was 14 years old. And I was very aware of this happening, but I grew up in Detroit. And we're going to talk about Detroit and Midwest rock later on. And from the vantage point of Detroit, people were not hippies in Detroit. So this was very much a localized phenomenon. And I think much of the attitude in Detroit, especially of older kids, 16, 17, 18-year-olds, and to a lesser extent me, I wasn't as much aware of it because, as I said, I was only 14 in 1967. But the hippie thing was a little bit silly, a little bit, well, maybe some of these kids got a little more money, but I certainly couldn't do that. I couldn't go off to California and live that lifestyle. Wouldn't really want to live that lifestyle. And although I did enjoy the rock music, and really enjoyed the psychedelic music. So let's go through the different stuff that's happening in the folder this week and get into this stuff. So first, societal change. No, actually first, anti-rock readings, 14, 15, 16. We'll talk about chapter 15 in a little bit. But let's move on to the folder, the second section, societal change and Summer of Love. Again, the hippies embracing counterculture stuff, especially the use of drugs and sex. And free love really came about as a result of the birth control pill being approved by the FDA in late 50s or early 60s, right around 1960. I'm not sure of the exact year. And the hippies did come out of the beat generation, the beatniks of the late 50s, the counterculture, experimenting with drugs and sexual liberties. And of course the hippies started in California and LA, then spread up to San Francisco, Haight-Ashbury. When you hear the hate, that's not hate, H-A-T-E, like I hate you, I love you. That's Haight, the name of a street in San Francisco, H-A-I-G-H-T, Haight Street. Haight-Ashbury was an area in San Francisco. Be sure you understand that when we talk about Haight Street or the Haight area. So the hippie movement, the flower children, they really railed against the status quo and the establishment. In 1967, the Summer of Love, we had a huge concert at the Monterey Pop Festival with Jimi Hendrix and The Who, and the hippies very much opposed the war in Vietnam, and it was a huge catalyst in the 60s. It really embraced alternative religions, especially Eastern religions, and the Beatles also really embraced this. The Beatles and the hippies worked with each other and pushed each other to new heights, and the Beatles, of course, becoming very psychedelic and used LSD and marijuana and accepted all the Indian stuff. So that leads us into the album of the decade, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, released in 1967, the Beatles' most influential album, and indeed the most influential album of all time. And the album was kind of conceived as a concept album where all the songs would really link together, although that didn't really work too well. But an incredible album, really the pinnacle of their career. Other very important albums that were released in the summer of 1967. Again, the Summer of Love, 1967, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and the Monterey Pop Festival. Jimi Hendrix. I love Jimi. Any chance I get to talk about Jimi, I will do it. Jimi Hendrix's first album was released that summer, as The Doors' first album was released in very early 1967. Also in summer of 67, the Grateful Dead's first album. So we have Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the Beatles, not their first album, but then we also have the first albums by Jimi Hendrix, The Doors, and Grateful Dead featuring Jerry Garcia, released in 1967. And interestingly, of course, as you know, both Jim Morrison and Jimi Hendrix would be gone by 1971. First Hendrix in September of 70, and then 10 months later, on June 3rd, I believe, Jim Morrison. So again, burning brightly and then burning out, similar to late 50s rock. Very, very strong parallels. 1959, late 50s rock. 1969, when we have this real death of rock and roll. We've got a few wonderful years, 1967, 68, then 1969, everything starts falling apart. So the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the hippies and societal change, but also really contradicting 180 degrees polar opposite of the war in Vietnam and what's happening over there, and certain young men getting drafted. I did not get drafted, and my older brother and I were both very, very fortunate. We did not go to Vietnam, but there was a big feeling of that. Well, here these hippies are there over there in California, and here we are sitting in Detroit and worrying about getting drafted. Interesting time. Moving right along, our review of comedy in the 50s and 60s, Bewitched, with Samantha and Darren Stevens. Of course, Samantha Stevens is a witch, and an important show in the fact that it showed women in a stronger role. Also had some good acting by a couple of fairly well-known people, Andorra, Samantha's mom, and also Paul Lynde, who became famous on Hollywood Squares later on. And some good acting, and also the fact that they showed Samantha and Darren actually sharing a bed. This was taboo in Hollywood before this time. Other shows would show two separate beds. The I Love Lucy show or the Dick Van Dyke show with Mary Tyler Moore would show the couples using two separate beds in the same bedroom, but two separate beds. But now we've got the sexual revolution happening, and we can share a bed. So read up on Bewitched, an important show, and also watch the one video clip we have of Bewitched. And as we move right along, so as we're moving through our assignment folder, we have the hippies and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. We have Bewitched, and let's talk about Hendrix a little more. Hendrix and Bob Dylan. I decided years ago I just have not talked about Bob Dylan enough in this class. Bob Dylan, a very important folkie who came out of the Woody Guthrie vein. If you don't know who Woody Guthrie is, please Google it. Dust Bowl folk pioneer who wrote "This land is your land, this land is my land." Bob Dylan coming right out of that vein and was a folkie, a hero of the folk generation, wrote protest songs, but in 1965, the Newport Folk Festival, Dylan was scheduled to appear and wanted to do his song Maggie's Farm. Ain't gonna work on Maggie's Farm anymore. Very good article about that incident. Bob Dylan decided to use electric musicians, drummer, bass player, keyboard player, and himself. He played electric guitar. And even though Newport Folk Festival had some rock blues type bands using electric instruments, Muddy Waters had been there the year before playing electric instruments, but the festival really, the folkies, really regarded Dylan as their prince, their folk prince, who was supposed to stand there with his acoustic guitar and his harmonica on the holder and sing about "The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind." So Dylan amplifies, and the crowd went crazy. They booed him, they threw stuff at him, and he continued to do his tour with electric instruments and got booed on the entire tour, but really electrified the folk and paved the way for groups such as the Byrds, who did much of the Dylan folk rock. And also the Beatles were very influenced by Dylan, especially John Lennon's "You've Got to Hide Your Love Away." But Jimi Hendrix was very influenced by Bob Dylan, was a huge Bob Dylan fan in the early days. Story goes that he would walk around with a Bob Dylan record under his arm and play it where any chance he got. Hendrix covered numerous Dylan songs, and All Along the Watchtower, one of his most famous songs, was written by Bob Dylan. Hendrix sang a lot like Bob Dylan. So there's some very good videos. Hendrix All Along the Watchtower, Hendrix doing Like a Rolling Stone, a Bob Dylan song, and also Hendrix singing his own composition, "And the Wind Cries Mary," sounding very much like Dylan on that. So, two people you'd think were worlds apart, yet actually Hendrix owed a lot to Bob Dylan. And as we move along, Hendrix and Dylan, next Movies are really evolving at this time. The big four we really want to talk about, the big four movies we really want to discuss in the late 60s period after Virginia Woolf and the Hays Code breaks down, and we have the new GMRX. What is GMRX? The new rating system, 1967, 1968. First time that movies had been rated. Before this, they were censored. Now we have ratings, voluntary rating systems that we still have today. The big four. You need to know these big four movies, because you'll be writing about them in your final paper. The big four movies are Bonnie and Clyde. You thought I forgot. Bonnie and Clyde, The Graduate, Easy Rider, and last but not least, Midnight Cowboy. All very important because they represent the anti-hero in society. We no longer have the big, strong John Wayne going out and killing the bad guys. We have the anti-hero, Bonnie and Clyde. Depression era criminals, a true story, Bonnie and Clyde, true story, that were glamorizing the criminal. In The Graduate, this week The Graduate, Dustin Hoffman's first major role, Anne Bancroft, who plays Mrs. Robinson. What a great actress. I really love her role in this. The movie is a bit slow at times. It's a good story, but a bit slow, using the Simon and Garfunkel soundtrack. Mrs. Robinson, a great song by Simon and Garfunkel, another group I don't talk about enough in this class. But we have the anti-hero Benjamin Braddock, who gets out of college in late 60s, doesn't want to be part of the status quo, doesn't want to just fall into some stupid office job, and doesn't really know what he wants to do. Again, the anti-hero. And then the classic anti-hero movie is probably Easy Rider, the two long-haired bikers going across the country from west to east, as opposed to the old pioneer going from east to west, going from west to east to sell drugs and encountering many sexual and drug situations along the way, and a very apocalyptic ending, a very sad apocalyptic ending. Not the best movie ever made, not the best written movie, but a very important movie for this concept of the anti-hero in our society. And last but not least of those big four, we have Midnight Cowboy, again X-rated. I've said it over and over again, you need to know this. X-rated, the only movie to receive an X rating by the Motion Picture Academy. X rating was later co-opted by the porn industry. The only movie ever to receive an X rating and to win the Academy Award. And once again, the anti-hero, but cast in the cowboy light, but the young cowboy kid goes to New York to become a male hustler and fails miserably. So those four movies really representing the new Hollywood, new directing, new production style, and also very much the concept of the anti-hero. Well, we're up to 12 minutes. We have to move right along. I think I can only go 15 minutes on these videos. I don't want to push it. Last but not least, our last section on the MC5, one of my favorite groups. You should know about the MC5. Very important for the evolution of punk music. And it's very interesting to see also the MC5 came out of Detroit, 1967, 1968. Polar opposite of what we're seeing on the West Coast, especially with the Grateful Dead psychedelic groups. The MC5 were gritty, urban, get-in-your-face, revolution, party. And let's think about what came out of Detroit. What other groups came out of Detroit? Because Detroit, this is the heartland. This is where I grew up. This is the heartland of America. We have the Ford, the big three motor companies there: Ford Motor Company and GMC, and also Chrysler Dodge. And it's working class, Grand Funk Railroad, Ted Nugent, Bob Seger, all this really middle of the road working class rock. Iggy Pop and the Stooges. Iggy Pop still around today. Iggy Pop and the Stooges and the MC5 were contemporaries, shared the stage many times. And interesting time, and the MC5 was not interested in being hippies, they were interested in revolution, and we're at the 1968 Democratic Convention. Read about the MC5, we'll never see anything like them again. Really always mentioned as one of the progenitors of punk music. So again, we have this dichotomy, East-West, or Midwest and West. We have the West Coast hippies, the Midwest working class rock and roll. And part of the reason I could never be a hippie, I was listening to the MC5. I did see the MC5 back in Detroit back in the day. I was listening to early Ted Nugent, his band, the Amboy Dukes, before he got famous as Madman Ted. I know Ted's a little hard to take. I can't listen to him anymore. Chapter 15 in the book. Oh, another few people from Detroit, Alice Cooper, and more recently, Eminem. So as you see, not really the hippie types. Iggy Pop, Bob Seger, Ted Nugent, Grand Funk Railroad, Alice Cooper, Eminem. Really the antithesis of the hippies. Chapter 15, be sure you read Chapter 15. Very good stuff on the MC5, on Neil Young's Ohio, the students being shot and killed in at Kent State in Ohio. So there you go. We're out of time, and I'll see you next time.